When it comes to the Holocaust, what immediately comes to mind? For many, it's hard to conceptualize this horrific piece of history, but understanding our past is key to how we move into the future. In school, we learn that the Holocaust is the systematic, bureaucratic, and state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime, its allies, and collaborators. In this program, we'll explore what all of that exactly means by visiting the National World War II Museum here in New Orleans and international sites of tragedy, memory, and memorialization. My name is Chris Deere, and I'll be your host for the National World War II Museum's two-part electronic field trip on the Holocaust. For the first part of our journey, let's go back and explore together how this history unfolded by visiting our two student reporters in the field.
Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party legally assumed power in Germany in 1933, but they didn't start with mass murder. Instead, they began implementing a series of measures aimed at targeting and excluding Jews from German society, each measure more radical than the previous. Anti-Semitism, or the prejudice and hatred of Jews, was a hallmark of Nazi racial ideology. But anti-Semitism didn't start with them. Hatred, prejudice, and fear of Jews dates back to the Middle Ages. For centuries, being Jewish meant that you followed a religious tradition that provided a structure for everyday life that was different from those of Christianity and other religions. This meant that European leaders in most of Christian Europe isolated Jews from most aspects of economic, social, and political life, and Jews typically lived in their own neighborhoods, called ghettos, apart from the rest of local populations. The exclusion of Jews from mainstream society contributed to the notion that Jews were outsiders. Mistaken scientific beliefs such as eugenics began to take hold in the 19th century, reinforced the erroneous idea that Jews constituted a separate, inferior race.
Nazi anti-Semitism incorporated all these elements, but especially promoted the idea of racial anti-Semitism. This was central to Hitler and the Nazi Party's race-based worldview. The Nazis believed that the world was divided into separate, distinct races, and that some races were inherently superior to others. Nazi racial ideology held that Germans were members of the superior Aryan race, while the quote-unquote Jewish race constituted the most inferior and dangerous race. The Nazis believed that Jews were a threat to Germans and needed to be removed from society. In this way, the Nazis rejected the notion that Jews were simply a distinct religious or cultural community and, instead, defined Jews by birth and blood. This meant that if your grandparents or other relatives were Jewish, then you were considered Jewish too, whether you practiced the religion or not. According to Hitler, even people who had Jewish relatives but had converted to Christianity or other religions were still considered part of the Jewish race.
We're starting our journey here at Zeppelin Field in Nuremberg, Germany. My name is Noah, and I'm a student reporter from New Orleans, Louisiana.
And I'm Elliot, a student reporter from Chappaqua, New York. Today we are at the site of the former Nazi Party rally grounds with Anne. Anne, thank you for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
We'd love to ask you some questions. Can you tell us about Hitler's rise to power?
Yeah, believe it or not, he came to power through legal means. Before the Third Reich, there was a parliamentary democracy here, what's called the Weimar Republic. And at one point, the Nazis had just under 40% of the vote. And the conservative president was convinced by others to offer him the chancellorship, that is, in the hopes that he would build a government and actually have to produce legislation. But what he did was exactly what he promised to do, establish a dictatorship.
And what does the name Nazi Party stand for?
It comes from the official name of it, National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. And in German you say Nationalsozialist, so Nazi. What's interesting is that National Socialist part was a part introduced by Hitler himself and probably is the least truthful of the party name. Socialist meant everyone should share in a community, but the nation was the most important thing to think of in its future.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the Nazi Party stood for?
What they promised people is, and one of the reasons they got votes, was stability. Weimar, this democracy was marked by a lot of political instability and, of course, economic instability. This was the time of the Great Depression, for example. In the U.S., there was high unemployment as well. They promised an end to that. They also promised that they would put Germany back at the same level as other countries. At the end of World War I, which Germany had lost, Germany was also forced to sign a guilt clause that they had caused the war, and many people felt shame about that. And Hitler and the Nazis and other conservative parties, first of all, they put the blame on others. They said Germany was stabbed in the back by communists, pacifists, and Jews on the home front. They shouldn't have lost, and that they would make good on that again. They'd put the country back in a powerful position.
And how were these groups, specifically Jews, legally discriminated against?
Legally, yeah, by rule of law. Basically, maybe you should know, as early as 1920, in the party platform, the Nazis hoped to ban any kind of physical contact, especially marriage or sexual contact between Jews and non-Jews. And then later on, there was discrimination. For example, shortly after they took power, on the 1st of April, 1933, there was a nationally organized boycott against Jewish businesses. And then a week later, there was a law passed that removed Jews from employment in a lot of very important professions, the legal system, the universities, as teachers, and so forth. And that took about a year of time to put through and remove Jews from many professions. And then, of course, the next step that is related to this place is the Nuremberg race laws.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what the Nuremberg race laws were?
Yeah, they were passed, you can't say. They were proclaimed here in September 1935 during one of the party rallies. And they were kind of strange. The first one made the swastika flag, the official flag of the country. That's not so important to our topic. But the second one basically distinguished between two different types of citizens, which they called Reich citizens. It's called the Reich Citizens Law, Citizenship Law, and Jews were excluded from that, for example. The third, and probably the worst of the laws, was what they called the law to protect German blood and German honor. And that was the one that put through this promise in the party platform of the Nazis that there would be no intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews. Later on, that was extended to other groups of, which they wished to discriminate against. So Africans, what we call Sinti Roma, and so forth.
And how does the place that we're standing in today, Zeppelin Field, connect to all of this? What happened here?
Well, first of all, I mean, not technically physically here, but it was during a party rally that they proclaimed these Nuremberg race laws, partially because there were so many people here. We think that there could be as many as 1 million people that came to these rallies towards the late 30s. And of course, avid supporters of the ideology in the party, so you could make yourself feel good about what you've done passing these laws and hopefully make them known to the widest possible public. The other thing here is, and you can see it in the architecture here, what they tried to promote all the time is what we call the Volksgemeinschaft. That was so important in their ideology. This idea that there was this community of blood or race, or what we nowadays usually call the people's community, and you define that community by who you excluded, rather than who belonged so much. And of course, Jews were those part of those groups that were excluded.
Thank you, Anne, for talking with us today and sharing a part of this history. It sounds like all of this contributed to stripping Jews of basic human rights and moved Germany further from a democracy into a dictatorship. There were even cases, like Anne mentioned, of outright organized violence against Jews that accompanied various forms of public identification and exclusion. The most notable example is Kristallnacht, which was a series of pogroms against the Jewish population in Germany and its recently incorporated territories on November 9th through 10th in 1938. Kristallnacht literally means night of crystal and is often referred to as the night of broken glass because of the shattered glass from Jewish-owned businesses, synagogues, and homes that covered German streets in the aftermath. The violence was instigated by the Nazi Party officials and members of the SA and Hitler Youth. During the pogrom, approximately 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and taken to concentration camps. We are going to continue our journey in a small town called Dachau. You might recognize this name as it was made infamous as the site of one of the first concentration camps.
Thanks, Noah. So what is a concentration camp exactly? Concentration camps were an essential feature in the Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945, and the term refers to a camp in which people are detained or confined, usually under harsh conditions and without regard to legal norms of arrests and imprisonments that are accepted in a constitutional democracy. The first concentration camp for political prisoners was established right here at Dachau in March 1933, but German authorities established concentration camps all over Germany to handle masses of real or imagined quote-unquote enemies of the state. Joining me today is Dr. Jason Dawsey, research historian at the National World War II Museum.
Thank you for the introduction, Elliot.
Of course. My first question for you is, what is the difference between a concentration camp, a work camp, and an extermination camp?
Elliot, those are crucial distinctions. When you're dealing with the Nazi regime, you're dealing with a regime that had all sorts of camps set up for enemies, threats. So they have, in this case, three distinct types we can talk about. Concentration camps, we're here at Dachau, the first of those, really set up to concentrate, isolate political enemies. Later on, they will expand who is sent there. If you're talking about a work camp, you're really talking about places usually for foreign force laborers who are compelled to work in the German war economy or do various types of construction tasks. The most terrifying of the three camps that you ask about are the extermination camps, where the ultimate goal is to physically annihilate the inmates, the victims. They may be required to do labor if they're deemed healthy enough at the start for a certain period of time, but all of those who were sent to extermination camps ultimately are targeted for one goal, that is murder.
Who was imprisoned at these early camps?
So at the beginning of the Nazi regime, if you're talking about 1933, right after Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany, they go after the political left. So what does that mean? It means communists, it means social democrats, it means trade unionists. They are perceived to be the greatest obstacles, the greatest threats to Nazi power. But they don't stop there after they're concentrated, isolated away from the population. Later on, you'll see gay men brought to Dachau and other concentration camps. You'll see people who are deemed asocials. You'll see Roma. You'll see Jews. You'll see Jehovah's Witnesses. It becomes a very long list.
How were these groups specifically targeted, and were Jews treated any differently?
Excellent question. So what they typically do is, depending on what's perceived to be the greatest threat to the regime, they have a huge secret police apparatus that accumulates information about groups, and then they move against them. They make mass arrests, and then these people are physically brought to the camp and shown that they're going to be isolated and kept here and will have to obey camp discipline. And there's no doubt that Jews are treated differently. In a place like Dachau, they are given punishments that are usually more severe than others, and there's a constant propaganda from camp leadership to ensure that every inmate knows that Jews are seen as the greatest enemy of the Third Reich.
Can you tell me the story of why Dachau was first created?
That story is totally tied in with the beginning of the Hitler dictatorship. And so there's this real focus on dealing with internal subversion, on cracking down on enemies. And so Dachau is part of this crackdown. Set up in March 1933. There had been an old munitions factory here, and it's due to Heinrich Himmler that the SS takes over this area. They will transform it into a camp complex that we still see parts of today, and the first inmates will arrive shortly thereafter.
What was life like for those who were imprisoned here at Dachau?
It's a severe, incredibly disciplined, and usually quite violent way of life that the SS established here. There are very stark rules about what can and can't be done, and the SS understanding is that when in doubt, you punish with maximum force. Beatings, whippings, people being tied to trees, mail being confiscated, solitary confinement. These are all means they used to discipline prisoners here in this early phase of the Dachau concentration camp.
Thank you, Jason, for sharing your insights on Dachau.
You're very welcome.
While the establishment of this camp may have not initially been specifically for Jews, how did we get there? At the beginning of 1939, international tensions were extremely high. It was in this context that Hitler gave his infamous Reichstag speech of January 1939, in which he told the German public and the world that the outbreak of war would mean the end of European Jewry, the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. War broke out in September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, making the transition in Nazi anti-Semitic policy towards the creation of Jewish ghettos and, eventually, genocide. Later that month, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union invaded the country from the east. Despite courageous resistance, the Poles had to surrender after a month of fighting. Once Berlin and Moscow had agreed on the borders of their respective Polish territories, roughly 2 million Jews fell under Nazi control.
Die Völker werden in kurzer Zeit erkennen, dass das nationalsozialistische Deutschland keine Feindschaft mit anderen Völkern will. Ich will heute wieder ein Prophet sein. Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht die Bolschewisierung der Erde und damit der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
While camps like Dachau we just visited are well-known sites of Holocaust history, there is another dark, lesser-known part of this history that is equally as important. The first victims of the Holocaust were not transported to extermination camps. These innocent victims perished at the hands of perpetrators during a period that is called the Holocaust by bullets. It was during this initial phase that German killing squads, Einsatzgruppen, coordinated the mass shootings of Jews with the help of SS, Wehrmacht, the Romanian Army, Special Operational Squadrons, Order Police units, and local collaborators. It is estimated these groups murdered 1.5 million Jews in this first phase. Here with us today is Dr. Chad Gibbs, Director of the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies and Assistant Professor for Jewish Studies at the College of Charleston. Thank you so much for being with us today and helping us understand this lesser-known part of Holocaust history.
Well, thank you, Noah. I'm happy to help.
What distinguishes this phase?
I think the thing that distinguishes this phase of the Holocaust most is the intimate brutality of what Jewish victims experienced during the Holocaust by bullets. Most of those 1.5 million people who were murdered during this phase of the Holocaust saw the Germans for a very short period of time. It might have only been the morning that they showed up in their village, ordered them all to come together and took them out into some forest like the one that we're standing next to here today, and paired off one victim with one shooter and took them out to a place where they forced them to lay down and shot them at point-blank range. It was really that close, horrible brutality of this phase that sets it apart from what came after.
And why did this method change, or why did it stop?
There are a few reasons that historians look at for why the Nazis moved from this version of perpetration to the next. Among those reasons, though, are what this style of intimate killing did even to the killers. Even for a highly ideologically motivated Nazi soldier or member of the SS Einsatzgruppen or recruited local collaborator, killing in this way had a severe effect, it seems, on their psyche. They were worried that either between celebration around these killings or by drinking just to get through what they were doing, that they were creating a whole generation of alcoholics. And beyond that, they were also quite well aware that they were creating millions of witnesses to this process all throughout Eastern Europe. And furthermore, they saw that the worldly goods of all those that they were killing were quite often ending up in the hands of various locals who saw what was going on and helped themselves. And the regime wanted that plunder for itself. So part of that decision to go to a different phase was looking for a way to solve those problems.
What evidence do we have that this Holocaust by bullets happened?
The evidence is really monumental. It's all across Eastern Europe. There are the sites that these killings took place. We can go into those forests where the Nazis took their victims and look for the remains. They themselves attempted to cover up all of these crimes by sending a formation called Sonderkommando 1005 out through these areas to attempt to destroy evidence in the later phases of the war, especially when it had sunken through to some of them that they might lose. Though even after that attempt, we still have a huge amount of physical evidence throughout those towns and forests of Eastern Europe.
And what work has been done presently to honor these victims?
I think that's one of the more amazing questions to answer here is some of that work is done by descendants of the communities that were destroyed in this way. So you can go to many little places throughout Eastern Europe and find a small memorial. Quite often that memorial was put in by Jews that might now live in the United States or in Israel or other places throughout the world, but they come back to honor the Jews from their hometown that didn't make it out alive. That can be a little marker at the town, or sometimes it's a little marker at the very site of the shooting. And a lot of what we know about this whole phase, including even what we call it, the Holocaust by bullets, comes from the work of a French priest named Father Patrick Dubois, whose book, The Holocaust by Bullets, kind of gave us that name, and his work to go to each and every one of these sites and talk with those surviving locals that witnessed the events has given us the map of what is now over 2,000 sites where these mass shootings took place.
Thank you, Chad, for sharing with us a piece of this lesser-known Holocaust history. Another step in the Nazis' process to separate and persecute was forcibly moving Jews into ghettos. Long-term, Nazi leadership had yet to settle on how to remove Jews from the Third Reich. They toyed with various ideas, including isolating Jews on the island of Madagascar off the coast of Eastern Africa. In the interim, Nazi leaders envisioned a solution: pushing Jews into ghettos and sealing them off. Let's continue our exploration with Elliot and Chad in Poland's capital, Warsaw.
Thanks, Noah. That's right. The Nazis revived this terrible practice in the territories they occupied. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Germans established at least 1,143 ghettos in the occupied Eastern territories. In some cases, Nazi-run ghettos were enclosed, separating Jewish communities from the non-Jewish population and from other Jewish communities. After the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Nazis established ghettos across newly conquered territory taken from the Soviet Union. The largest of these ghettos was here in Warsaw. In the small span of 1.3 miles, over 450,000 Jews were packed into tight quarters and subjected to miserable living conditions. Chad, thank you for joining us again. Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about discriminatory practices going on here in Poland?
Sure. Elliot, the discriminatory practices against Jews in this area are immediate, just about as soon as the Nazis get to this area, as soon as they conquer Poland. Early on, they issue the edict that Jews must wear the star, either as an armband or as a patch on their clothing, and they start to take away their businesses, their livelihoods, and put them into the ghettos that you were talking about.
While I was walking around, I noticed that there's remnants of what seems to be a wall. Can you tell us more about that and maybe when and why it would have been constructed?
Sure. So the wall is built after the Warsaw Ghetto is created and enclosed from October, November 1940. So at that time, the Nazis have not yet decided that they're going to murder all of Europe's Jews, but they have decided that they're going to place them into some sort of contained area, probably then use them as slave laborers or in other ways, and that they're very, very interested in making sure that Jews can't escape their clutches and are subject to their power at all times. And the ghettoization really allows them to have full control over Jewish lives for whatever they might decide will come next.
To you, what does it really mean to be incarcerated?
To be put here was a terrible and deadly place to endure. Around 90,000 Jews died in the Warsaw Ghetto from the conditions imposed on them here, from that overcrowding, malnutrition, typhus epidemics that broke out in that very, very tight conditions of living here. Between 7 and 9 people on average lived in each room in the Warsaw Ghetto. So there were just so many people that it was more than even those attempting to care for each other could take care of. So I think that when I think of this place, I just think of the real suffering that must have gone along with being held in this spot and made to work for the Germans and live in these conditions.
For those who tried to care for each other, what attempts did they make at that?
That's a pretty amazing list of things, really. There were underground schools, because putting Jewish children in schools at the time here was illegal. There were efforts to maintain sanitation and put together hospitals that could care for the sick and injured here. There were even cultural events just to keep people's spirits up. Of course, there were many underground newspapers so that people could maintain some sort of knowledge of what was going on around them. Resistance took a lot of forms in the Warsaw Ghetto and in many of the ghettos across Nazi-occupied Europe.
If it really was this terrible, instead of just resisting by setting up schools and educating their young, why didn't they fully resist and try to escape?
They did, and in January of 1943, the first rumblings of the Warsaw Ghetto take place when the Germans come in to begin the process of deportations over again. There had been a pause from earlier, and in January of 43, the Germans had come in to begin trying to take Jews out of the Warsaw Ghetto again. But at that time, they found armed resistance ready to attempt to push them out of the ghetto, and they stopped. From January to April of 1943, they had waited, and in April 19th, 1943, Nazi forces attempted to come back into the ghetto to deport the remaining Jews here, and at that time the full Warsaw Ghetto uprising began, which would take almost a month for Nazi forces to put down and result in both the end of the ghetto entirely and one of the largest uprisings in Jewish resistance during the Holocaust.
Was there a link between where we are now and extermination camps like Treblinka?
Absolutely. We're standing at what's called the Umschlagplatz, which was the point of embarkation for Jews being sent from Warsaw to Treblinka. So thousands of Jews were forced to come to this place, just on the border of the ghetto, by the train line, and wait for a train that would take them to Treblinka, where they would be murdered by Nazi Germany.
Thank you, Chad, for sharing this important piece of history with us, and the small glimmer of hope and resistance that came from the uprising despite its ultimate end. Noah, I'm grateful to be on this journey with you.
This isn't the end of our journey. Join us for part 2 of the electronic field trip as we continue to explore the complex history of the Holocaust by learning about death and extermination camps, liberation, and memorialization at those sites.
Tune in live on March 26th at 9 a.m. CT or 1 p.m. CT for part 2, where you will be able to interact with experts and historians. We hope you will join us as we continue to unpack these hard topics and reflect on the Holocaust, how it happened, and how we can honor those victims even today.